We might have lost universality, but we still have confusion. Allow me to start there in confusion, not with Nancy, but with Lacoue-Labarthe. Nancy and Lacoue-Labarthe's co-writings constitute an exceptional form of being together, of having been together, an impossible fusion that did take place, however. So confusingly, I'll get off on a single foot, the other one, Lacoue-Labarthe, and his fiction of the political. For Lacoue-Labarthe, this is a fiction of unity in community. As you know, the book contains a rejection of Heidegger's involvement in Nazism. Heidegger's, I quote, thinking of ecstatic Dasein and finitude should have prevented any confusion of Mitsein with the notion of community as substance. Both fusion and confusion play a significant role in Labarthe's view on Heidegger's misguided analysis, as Pierre-Philippe Gendin puts it. Heidegger allowed his philosophy to merge into, quote, a kind of transcendental illusion, the people as subject of history, that's the fusion, and so created the confusion between his own idea of Mitsein and the vulgar essentialist understanding of community in Nazism. So the fusion is both real and imagined. There is, you could argue, a fusion between fusion and confusion. Imagination and spirit, ideology, philosophy, contain the confusion. The community embodies the fusion. The fusion energizes everything. There lies the danger. It's the Mitsein of illusions. Some years later, in his Musica Ficta, Lacoue-Labarthe magnificently elaborated on the idea of fusion, diffracting the concept in a multitude of shades: confusion, transfusion, effusion, profusion. Heidegger's refusal of a modern, let's say, Wagnerian political aestheticism, paraphrased by Lacoue-Labarthe as the politics of effective effusion, wasn't enough to stop the same Heidegger from introducing the kind of, quote, appeal to decisiveness, which would eventually make him an accomplice to national aestheticism. The effective effusion blends in with the very ontopolitical bigotry it tries to avoid or to overcome. Fusion's gravity once more. We see a similar suspicion of fusion and its perilous effects in Nancy. Quote, fusion never happens in La Jouissance. To believe otherwise is to be confused. A lot could be said at this point on the confusing etymological meaning of fusion, more specifically on the interesting confusion between the Latin fundere, to pour, to shed, to scatter, fusus, and fundare, to found, fundum, fundamentum. Confusion we also find in related Greek verbs and nouns. But I won't bore you with that etymo stuff, except for this one surprising element. When we say found, fondé in French, the Romans used another concept, condere. We remember Livius ab urbe condita, from the founding of the city. Condere is actually cum dare, literally to give with, giving together. For the early Romans, conditum, the shared gift or shared present, was the political fundamentum of being with. Now the negation of conditum is inconditum, which literally means, quite bizarre, confused, scattered. Yet there is method in the bizarre, since the true story of Rome was indeed the history not of the condita, the well-ordered togetherness, but of the incessant confusion, civil discord, the everlasting struggles between plebeians and patricians, the brutal wars and civil wars. One could say that the Livian history, and with it political philosophy since at least Machiavelli, up to Lefort and Mouffe, was as much an ab urbe incondita, the state of permanent confusion as the driving force of Roman unity, as it was ab urbe condita. The foundational, the dispersed, The concentrated, the confused, the solid, the fluid, the abyssal, they all seem to merge. So fusion never happens? Well, maybe in ontology it doesn't. Philosophically as well, the often confusing encounter of the human mind with reality is long-standing. Kant's struggle with the phenomenon is legendary. The critique of pure reason is the gigantomachia against the confusion of the human mind, as well as the odyssey of its elevation to transcendental clarity. It's being supplied with a metaphysical ground, reason's Allgemeinheit. On the other hand, Kant's critique of the power of judgment seems to welcome confusion and its multiplicity, Mannigfaltigkeit of feelings, facilitating the playfulness of aesthetics, from simple agreeableness all the way up to the sublime both as ground and effusion, Ergießung, says Kant, as foundation and abyss, fundum and fusus, singularity, das Einzelne, and limitlessness, Unbegrenztheit, infinitude. I'll come back to the destinerance of Allheit and Allgemeinheit, and to the potentiality of the inconditum and of confusion in general. Lacoue-Labarthe applied the concept of affective effusion to Heidegger because of his almost entirely Kantian approach to modern aestheticism in the famous lectures on Nietzsche. Heidegger too looked for a ground but found himself an abyss. Again, confusion reigns. Fundus become fusus, I quote Lacoue-Labarthe, a process which finds its truth in a communal fusion communale, in the ecstatic identification with a leader who in no way represents any form of transcendence, but incarnates in immanent fashion the immanentism of a community, end of quote. Here we already come across Nancy. The dynamics of confusion and effusion are also examined by him. Only Nancy seems to take it one step further. The key concept in Nancy's philosophy is diffraction. It's the active and deliberate effusion of being. The concept is present quite expressively in many texts, from the classic works to the smaller books and essays. It first appears, to my knowledge, in The Experience of Freedom, 1988. There, freedom is famously defined as the very, quote, the very thing that prevents itself from being founded. This idea owes much to the Heidegger of Was ist Metaphysik, vom Wesen des Grundes, vom Wesen der Wahrheit. I quote Nancy. There is, in italics, to stress the Heideggerian Dasein, the free dissemination of existence. This free dissemination is not the diffraction of a principle, nor the multiple effect of a cause, but an anarchy, with a dash, of a singular and thus in essence plural arising, whose being as being is neither ground nor element nor reason, but truth, freedom. The being singular plural of 1996 is already clearly announced here. Not the diffraction of a principle, Nancy wrote. Indeed, it is more than that. There is diffracted being, one should read. In the Sense of the World, 1993, Nancy rephrases, and I quote, the very gesture of the present, présent, the gesture of presenting, présenter, the place of the diffraction of the present. Being itself, end of quote, being itself is diffraction, and diffraction constitutes a way of sensing being. There's a clear reciprocity. Diffracted being is being diffracted. That's what art makes us understand. Art is fragment, vestige, as it is called elsewhere, and the past, art history, itself being diffracted all the time, is art predominantly. As all art, striking the eye, shows us the diffracted, the fragments, and shows us meaning, makes sense. The artwork is at the same time, I quote, infinitely ancient and definitely present. The very sense of appearance and the appearance of sense, unveiling the perpetual diffraction of being. Gradually, as becomes clear in the same text, Nancy will even start thinking in terms of fractal essences and fractal sense. Or later, in Being Singular Plural, he says, the very concept of the community or of the city is being diffracted in every sense. It shows how fast the effusive idea of diffraction ran deep in Nancy. Another major concept will eventually seize this rich context in a singular plural sense. L'éclat, Susanna already mentioned it, appearance, both as fragment and as splendor, brilliance, radiance, and as Derrida observes, as burst, the burst of laughter, l'éclat de rire. Nancy's philosophy, Derrida writes in Le Toucher, is the splendor of diffraction, a bursting diffraction, l'éclat de diffraction. In a finite thinking, that bursting diffraction is also called la mise en éclat, revealing the law and the logic of being in general, no less. It comes down to the infinite exposition of finitude, l'exposition infinie de la finitude. The ever ungrounding constitution of diffraction, being's law, la mise en éclat, is at the heart, Nancy's italics, of being. Éclat, itself an effusive polysemic concept, becomes a key in the understanding of one of Nancy's key concepts, diffraction. This meticulous unfolding of diffraction constitutes further proof, if ever one was needed, of the proximity between Nancy and Lacoue-Labarthe. Being diffracted is literally effusion, effundere, the being scattered of being. Moreover, aesthetically, in French, éclat means effusion, effusion affective. Both signify the sudden, uncontrollable appearance of an aesthetic joy. Both thinkers are very close to each other here. But where Lacoue-Labarthe holds on to an analytical approach, Nancy's bursting diffraction is of a more synthetic nature, radicalizing the ontological idea of effusion itself, detaching the Heideggerian Mitsein from its foundations. Diffraction is Nancy's counter-strategy against the ecstasy of Seinsdenken. Sense, in that perspective, is the being exposed of being diffracted, is the being exposed to being diffracted. At the same time, as Nancy writes in L'Oubli de la Philosophie, we're also exposed to sense. Meaning, sens, that's us. Together we appear, nous comparaissons, and that appearance is sense. That we of sense, which is sense, that sense which is the being of we, requires an ontology which is still to come, encore à venir. What doesn't necessarily mean that it will arrive, viendra, but maybe that it is in itself as a thinking ordained by the dimension of arrival or occurrence. Our appearing together exactly, which is our being presented, présentation, in the element of sense. We are exposed, that there is our being, c'est là notre être, or it is the sense of being, c'est le sens de l'être. Without that exposition, no signification would have any sense, end of long quote. So, sense does and does not emerge from states of confusion. Confusion alone would be all too Kantian, Verworrenheit, and certainly too Heideggerian, Gerede, Zweideutigkeit. It would be too Cartesian as well. There's this beautiful Sarah Kofman-like passage of his book Ego Sum on Descartes' confusion, La Confusion de Descartes, and I quote, "There is no subject but in erection, en érection. the very erection which submerges it, or him, Descartes, le plonge, in confusion. Descartes' world-famous "Therefore I Am" title of Nancy's book is the simulating mask of confusion. The hard subject becomes confused by the very thing supposed to save it from puzzlement. Erection of the ego, transcendence, transcendentalism, ecstatical existentialism. Surely, Nancy's being diffracted runs deeper than being confused. There is undoubtedly a clarity and a colorfulness to Nancy's philosophy of diffraction, something splendid indeed. Nevertheless, a point of confusion exists, claiming that the we of sense requires an ontology, just quoted, that it is our being, that is the sense of being, is clear and distinct language. But a deeper confusion is entailed. Nancy's consistent diffracting reinterpretation of Seinsdenken keeps in place a profound entanglement with Heideggerian ontology. Simply put, being diffracted is still being. A being, understood, singular plural, preserving an intimate contiguity with Heidegger's view on temporality, namely the dimension of arrival, of occurrence, venir, survenir. A being with being, so to speak. Now I can hear you think, sure, being with his being and being exposed his being, obviously, so what? My point is this. Sharing ontology did keep Nancy's philosophy firmly within the boundaries of the traditional ontosphere, so typical of the development of Western metaphysics. Sein und Zeit upheld the tradition through the prioritizing of the temporality of being, gewesen sein, Dasein, eigentlich zukünftig sein, and its ecstasy, rooted in the radical openness of zu sein, être à. A misguided analysis, Jourdain writes, leading to Jourdain, the dreadful historical destiny, destinalité of the community. Exactly, this misguidance was to serve as the foundation of Nancy's being with and being exposed. Heidegger's dangerous question, le sens de l'être, and the inadmissible answers formulated in Sein und Zeit forced Nancy, according to Jourdain, to create a new ontology, the being singular plural, what I have called, but in Nancy's words, the being diffracted. Descending deeper than his friend Lacoue-Labarthe, I believe, into the grounds and ungrounds of Heideggerian thinking, something stuck, a fragment of the original ontology, I'm inclined to say, something blurring the overall clarity of l'éclat. That's what I call the point of confusion. Towards the end, Nancy effectively showed some concern about being, disturbed maybe by the confusing ontological kinship. We must learn to exist without being, exister sans être. He urges his readers in the final paragraphs of The Banality of Heidegger, 2015. Adding to that, he claims being is not, most assuredly. History is not confined to being the destiny of its forgetting. Undoubtedly, it is also, and since long ago, escaping from that destiny, or else it has made it err, and it still does. End of quote, with reference to Derrida at the end. I'm quite fond of these exacerbations. Exist without being. Being is not. Effective effusions, as it were. Almost des éclats de désespoir, going against virtually everything he had thought before. And just this one quote from Being singular plural, being is not without being, being is. The confusion stems, I believe, from Heidegger, from his well-known original project of a destruction of the history of ontology, and from our inadequate response to it. For neither ontology nor its history were destroyed or even deconstructed. Instead, already in Sein und Zeit, its dramatization occurred, its generalization. The destruction of ontology ended up a recalibration, and Heidegger's Kehre, a glorious restoration of being, Sein with a Y, and of thinking of being. The supremacy of being as verbal expression remained intact, considered throughout Zeit to be the only verbal mode of time, or for that matter, of historical relations possible, to the exclusion of all others. Having history was never an issue, let alone the purpose. Being was all that mattered. Being history, being historical, being future, being occurrence, being arrival, being exposition. But being is only being half. When it comes to defining temporal structures, being is always only being half. In Nancy as well, being remains intact, whole. Being's supposed universality, however, is an ontological deceit. I'm almost convinced that Nancy's desperate lashing out to being, exists without being, is a token of his awareness of this deep deceit and of his thinking sharing this ontological point of confusion with Heidegger. Nancy's diffraction is clear, splendid, as an alternative for ontological ecstasy, but also confusing as an extension of being, the thinking of being, of traditional exclusiveness of ontology. The effect of this confusion can be seen possibly in Nancy's attitude towards universality. I go to my conclusion with this. In The War of Monotheism, 2003, Nancy states that the domination of Western civilization is in fact the power of the assertion of universality, necessarily entailing the will to domination and normalization, but also necessarily failing, since the universal cannot be given in a presence. The desire for oneness, for all-powerfulness and all-presence, is a dire consequence of the millennia-old ideal of universality, a monstrousness, Nancy adds, an unworld, l'immonde, a dangerous decomposition of meaning. Here's my point. Universality is only dominant, be it spiritual or material, in a world where the ontology is exclusive, where ontology equals thinking. In the realm of being, universality, something going wrong there. In the realm of being, universality simply is and is all. Kant called universality consecutively Allheit and Allgemeinheit. In universality and a priori universality, he saw the unpuzzling ground of the possibility of experience and of rationality. Heidegger, in his interpretation of Kantian metaphysics, Kant to das Problem der Metaphysik, assigned the value of universality to the basic originality of the inmost ground of the finitude of Dasein. Universality is being universally, exclusively. Everything and anything follows from that. Whatever entitas comes to existence, to expression in ontology, ignites the kindred violence of the universal. The problem seems to be being itself rather than its ecstasy. It's difficult to see how, under the conditions of exclusiveness, plurality could escape dominance, or pluriversity, or whatever other entity one critically imagines. It's recalibration of being time and again. Onto-forming the world seems to be an incurable desire. It got a hold of Nancy as well, I guess, as he tried to escape ontological ecstasy, but stumbled while erring into ontological plurality. Nancy's harsh criticism of universality, and that of many others today, touches upon a boundary of or in being, upon its ground, as Heidegger called it in its Kant commentary. But it also testifies, I believe, to Nancy's own unrest concerning the whole thinking of being and the thinking of whole being. I conclude. Being isn't necessarily the only verbal mode of expressing something universal. Having universality is perfectly possible without being universal. Having lost universality is also more than just a possibility. It's a real experience today, our experience. We only might have lost it because we had it in the first place. Universality does occur outside the ontosphere, outside being sense. It occurs outside the hegemonic ontological thought. Human worlds and worlds of humanity exist next to all ongoing efforts of onto-forming humans. Last paragraph, if I may. Today, the loss of universality seems to be our individualization at the limit of sense, puzzling us and puzzling the world. We have it, that loss, and we have to take it. It has us. To translate it into Nancian language, the burst and the radiance, éclat, of the universal is not, cannot be. You only partially, but partially infinitely have it, as it has you. The violence of universality isn't owing to being as such, as Nancy seemed to think, but to being's exclusiveness. The inconditum, both as unconditional, ungrounded, and confused, of any being would be to always also exist outside being, outside being's exclusiveness and being's éclat. Not ecstatically, for that's an outside within being. But if that is the case, and I'm really only asking questions, the writing of an ab humanitate incondita is a task lying before us now, after Jean-Luc Nancy, and I don't mean after his death, but after his lively thinking, his finite universality. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. And now we have time for one or two quick questions, and then we have a short break. Paul, please.
Yes. Hello, Peter. You talked a lot about being. You didn't mention the role of technique very much. Actually, the technique is foremost the figure of universality that we lost. What would you think about this, the competing terms between techniques and being? Is it the same, or what would you say?
Well, you could, you might say, or you might answer in a Heideggerian way by saying that the deployment, the development of the technological aid is really the forgetfulness of being, but that keeps you in the logic of being, exactly. And I'm not sure, and that was the point I was trying to make, I'm not sure if the continuous attention to being and the thinking of being, be it in an ecstatical manner in Heidegger or a non-ecstatical manner in Nancy. And I think both are approaches of the same problem, suffices to really get to the bottom of what I call the problem of the exclusiveness of our ontological look on reality. I didn't have another perspective on it, but I think in another way it might also be something that is near to what, for instance, Susanna said about the thinking of nature, or what Ian said in relation to science. What I was trying to do is to concentrate on the thinking, not so much on the outer world, not that I want to give the impression that it's only about meditation and thinking of the self and the world, etc. But I mainly was trying to make the point that Nancy, in his way of going against a lot of thoughts in Heidegger, nevertheless has a common origin, which is the same ontological way of looking at the world, let's say it like that, and that especially in his late criticism of universality, this common, for me, confusing ontological point becomes clear. It's a clear answer to your question.